Software supply chain security is a topic that's getting a lot more attention in recent years. So with me today is Janet Worthington, Senior Analyst at Forrester, who's going to be discussing the topic in a panel discussion at the Forrester Security and Risk Summit next week. The panel is called Reimagining Software Supply Chain Security. Janet, thank you so much for making time today.
Thanks, Sarah, for having me.
I don't know how many times I've said reimagining and kept just about mispronouncing it, reimagining, but let's start there. Why do we need to reimagine software supply chain security? What are we getting wrong? What have we been getting wrong all this time?
Yeah, so I think when we think about software, today, we don't necessarily think about it as part of an interconnected software supply chain. And I think some of the recent events of this past summer, if you just look at, we had a worldwide IT outage. We also had the XZ-Utils hack, where attackers use social engineering to compromise a relatively unknown library and embed a backdoor in the Unix OS. Luckily, it was found before it was widely distributed, but they both kind of remind us about the fragility of the software supply chain. And the reason that it's so complicated, I think, when we think about the software supply chain and why we really need to think about it as a supply chain itself, is that there are many different suppliers, distributors, components, materials, just like you would have in a physical supply chain. If you just think about, when you go to develop a product, you're writing code in an IDE, you're pulling down open source libraries and frameworks, you're probably calling into other third-party APIs. You're doing all of that with tools and code that likely you didn't write. Now, you then have to go and build that code, assemble that code, package that code, deploy that code, run that code. And so when you think about it from that perspective, you can see that there really is many steps and phases within the supply chain, and it's all built on software. And we need to really understand what makes up our software supply chain and understand the different components about it, so we can start thinking about how do we secure it. If we, a couple of things that can potentially happen, like some examples when we think about the software supply chain, maybe, one of your developers accidentally downloads an open source package. It looks completely legitimate. It has 5 stars on GitHub, it's got, thousands of downloads, but turns out to be malicious. And that package is then bundled into your application. That application is then sent downstream to your customers. Well, now you've put your customers at risk. And when your customers, when they deploy that, when they install that, attackers have, implanted that backdoor. Now they can go after your customers. And not only do we worry about the customers of these suppliers, but we also worry about their customers. When we looked at the MOVEit breach that happened last year, Progress Software, their customers got breached. Everybody from, medical insurance company, to medical to insurance companies, to government agencies, everybody. I think my own data was taken in that attack, unfortunately. But everybody's data, a lot of data was compromised. But it wasn't just Progress Software that had to face the consequences. It was also their customers that had class action lawsuits against them because they weren't protecting their end users, customer, because they weren't thinking about the software as part of a supply chain. They were just thinking, I have this FTP software and I have this thing over here and I have that thing over there. You really need to think about the whole connection so that you can understand the risks that you bring by using software, whether it's you're downloading it from open source, a third-party project, whether you're buying it from a commercial vendor, whether you have somebody come in and build it for you. you really have to understand how it's all interconnected so you can think about where are my risks in that supply chain and what do I do to mitigate?
Well, so the idea of the software bill of materials, or the SBOM, as we like to call it, was created to do exactly, I think, what you're talking about doing, where the idea of we've got these various open source components that might be in this piece of software that maybe then I'm using to create my software. And if I just have this ingredients list, essentially, then it helps me keep track of what's going on. And it seems like that's been hard to get off the ground. And even when it does get off the ground, some critics have felt like it's not really feasible, or it's not really sufficient to handle this problem. So from your research and your discussions and the panelists that you're talking to, that you have as part of this conversation, do you see an SBOM as part of the full supply chain security approach, or is it just not even something we should be talking about anymore?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. We definitely have heard a lot of critics over what this software bill of materials. I think the first thing that we need to understand in the software supply chain is, what role are you fulfilling? And so there's different roles in the software supply chain. You could be the one creating the software. You could be the run, and then you're considered a producer. You could be the operator, the one running the software, or you could be the chooser, the customer who's saying, I want to buy this software. I want to run this software. So I think you first have to understand what your role is. And at any given time, you're playing more than one role, probably. Right. And then you have to understand, what tools do you have in your toolbox to fulfill your mission? If you're the producer, if you're the one creating the software, you need to be secure by design. CISA talks about this all the time. And as part of being secure by design, you need to provide transparency. And how do you provide transparency? Well, a software bill of materials is a tool to do that. Now, on its own, a software bill of materials, to your point, is just an ingredients list. But what you need to do is, if you are the operator, you're going to then take that software bill of materials and you're going to monitor that software bill of materials to see if there's any newly disclosed vulnerabilities. If you're the one choosing the software, you're going to make having a software bill of materials a requirement as part of the purchasing process, and you're going to assess it so that you can understand any security, operational, or legal risk that you're bringing in. And the whole idea is the SBOM isn't an end game. It's a tool to kind of help you get the transparency and visibility that you need to get into that complicated supply chain that we talked about before. And so once you have that information, you can make better decisions about it. And so I think that, yes, I know there's been pushback on SBOMs. I'm seeing more adoption of SBOMs. I'm actually seeing more of our Forrester clients are calling to say, hey, I want to, I know there's risks out there. It's part of my procurement process. How do I ask for software bill of materials? What do I need to do once I have it to understand? And I'm also hearing from producers more and more, like, yes, I get asked for my software bill of materials. I need to be able to have a way that I can not just generate this as a one-off, I need to be able to automate this so that not only can I provide transparency to the operator and the chooser, but also it's a tool for the producer as well. I mean, the producer finds out information from the software bill of materials that they might not know about, known vulnerabilities that are out there, outdated libraries that they may be using. And so I think there's a lot of use for the software bill of materials. I think some of the criticism that we've seen on software bill of materials, I think the ability to assess the software bill of materials, the tools are sort of catching up, right? So it's the producers have tools to create them. I think as the choosers, the consumers, the tools out there to help you assess and understand it, they're there, but they're kind of catching up with the market. And I think as that grows and choosers feel more confident to be secure by demand, which is what CISA talks a lot about, they'll start asking more. The more they ask, the more producers are going to have to provide that SBOM and be prepared to. And be prepared with an SBOM. Even if they don't get asked, they should be prepared to provide it.
It's got to be hard to keep up to date, though, when each component of everything is constantly being itself updated, and there might be a new vulnerability that gets released, et cetera, et cetera. We could talk about just that one question for, you know, the entire day. So what do you see people having the most? I guess what's shifting the most? What's changing the most? Where are people having the biggest challenges or the biggest successes as this whole entire field kind of develops?
So you're right. Yeah, keeping an SBOM up to date can be difficult if you don't automate it. So that's really why we push so much on the automation. Like, can you automate the generation of a software bill of materials during the development process? The answer is yes. There are open source free tools out there that will do it for you. Software composition analysis solutions will do that for you. Now, the next step is, how do I get that updated software bill of materials to my customer or my consumer or the person operating it? That's sort of like the next step, is what sort of the, you know, if you can think of that, there's like a software bill of materials community out there. That's kind of what they're working on. What is a secure way? Do I put it as a producer? Do I put it on my portal? And I've seen very forward-thinking vendors do this. They have a portal that they push the software SBOM to, that their customers can come and download it from in a secure manner. You know, there are exchanges that people are working on, protocols to make sure that this can be done in a standardized way from an open source perspective. So I think that's sort of the next, you know, how do we have something that's standardized, a way to say, I'm going to share this with you, and this is the frequency I'm going to share it with you. Now, I know a lot of the pushback comes from the hyperscalers, the cloud hyperscalers, and the SaaS providers, because they're like, the minute I generate an SBOM, it's like out of date. So I would say, again, you guys are probably the most sophisticated software companies on the planet. Automation. And so I think that's sort of where it comes in. Now, you know, there's going to have to be agreements between who's ever the chooser and the producer about how frequently this stuff is exchanged, et cetera, how it's exchanged. But I do think that, you know, keeping them up to date from the producer side, yeah, you have to automate it. And so I think that's sort of where, you know, CISA's guidance has always been as well. I do think we're seeing more governments pay attention to this. And so you have the US government that put out the executive order in May of 2021 that was like, hey, we need software supply chain transparency. SBOMs are a way to do that. You're also seeing in the EU CRA that just got approved that they are not necessarily going to make you give an SBOM initially, but if they may come and request it from you. So you had better be prepared if you fall under that, if you're a software manufacturer in the EU that sells in the EU, that you're prepared to provide that. And I think we're seeing more and more governments realizing that an SBOM is a really great tool. Now, it's, you know, it needs processes around it. It needs people to have you know, agreements on how things are shared, what happens if you give me your SBOM and I find a vulnerability in it, like, what does that mean? And so I think there's a lot that the community is still working through, but I do think we're seeing more adoption, in part because for a couple of reasons. One, I think more governments are like, we need to get on this because this is a national security issue. And number two, I think we've just seen so many breaches. You know, I don't think that we can say, you know, we'll just continue to think about software and in its little bubble. It's part of a supply chain, and we need to think about it that way. And that's why I'm really excited to have 3 panelists with me next week who are going to kind of talk about their different viewpoints on the software supply chain and on software bills of material. To kind of just give you an idea who's going to be there. The first panelist, her name is Cassie Crossley. She's a vice president of supply chain security at Schneider Electric. And she actually authored a book on software supply chain security. The next panelist is Rosa Underwood. She is the acting senior cybersecurity advisor and IT specialist at the General Services Administration for the US. So they are the people that tell the other government agencies how to think about when you procure, how do you think about software security. And then Dr. Allan Friedman, who is a senior technical advisor and strategist at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency in the US. He actually is the one that has been doing a lot of the, I'd say, awareness, adoption, trying to kind of wrangle both the government and the industry around software bills of material. And he's been traveling around the world talking to different governments about how they're doing it, trying to make sure that we all kind of some kind of standardization as well as awareness on it. And so you couldn't ask for 3 better panelists on this. So I'm kind of excited to, take the questions that you're asking next week and see what they have to say on it, because they all come from a different perspective on how their role in the software supply chain and how they maybe they're generating the SBOM, they're utilizing the SBOM, et cetera.
No, that's a fantastic panel. I mean, you do have a great cross section of people, and there's so many questions that I have for you, Janet. But one of the things that I've been wondering is really, are we moving towards a time where we will have regulation or standards, at least, on this that are more similar to the way that we regulate other kinds of products and technologies, as far as the way that governments do procurement and the way that the automotive industry and the manufacturing industry does have to have some kind of responsibility for and liability for the end user when they do all of their procurement for every other little, bits and pieces that they use as part of building their tool that they are selling. There's a lot of different things and a lot of rules about maintaining national security and maintaining human rights when they're buying, products from other countries. There's a lot of things that are in place for other industries, but have not necessarily been so much in place as it relates to information technology and software. So when you're talking to your panelists and you're talking to other people, does it seem like we might be finally moving towards that for software? Or are we just going to keep kind of patching together this set of norms ultimately, because we've just had so many problems like the ones you mentioned with XZUtils and MoveIt, and then our problems with Snowflake and with CrowdStrike and everything else that we've had recently that are kind of related to that? It's a big question.
Yeah.
Or big questions. I don't know how many at you at the same time.
So what we're seeing already is we are seeing more of a move towards regulation. The only thing that's in law right now in the United States is around FDA for medical devices. They do now need to submit a software bill of materials in order to even start the market research process. Now that's great, right? That's something we're moving towards, but we've been trying to get legislation through since 2014. So it's been a long time. Now, I think the executive order that Biden put into place was pivotal because it sort of sparked us all kind of thinking about it more generally beyond just the medical devices, for example. And there was a lot of work that the NTIA did and CISA and other government agencies to standardize what does an SBOM look like? What is the minimum requirements for it? How are you going to use it? What are the different use cases that are sort of involved in that? And there's been a lot of work around that. And there's even been the Office of Management and Budget put out a memo last year saying, hey, if you're going to sell to the federal government, you better be prepared to tell us about your software development practices, how you're doing them, and It's a little bit up to the agencies right now, but we'd like a software bill of materials. So we're seeing that drive traction. Now, do I think that's going to go into law anytime soon? I think it's hard. I think, Congress is, it takes a while to get anything done, so we'll see. But I would say what the executive branch has been doing has been trying to push this along. The National Cybersecurity Strategy that came out last year said, hey, look, we know this is a problem, and we are tired of end users like you and I, or businesses that buy software, that the responsibility of security always falls on us, right? If something happens, there's really not much that, from a liability standpoint, that happens. Maybe you get an email that you now have free credit rating for a year, but I don't know, I've had free credit rating for the same year 5 times. Really not helped me. And so I think there's an idea of what kind of liability could we say? And, if you are putting in good cybersecurity practices, will that be okay, even if something happens for that company? And so I think we're seeing the US, sort of move towards that. From, the idea of cars and manufacturing, I think we're starting to see, they've always had to track everything, all these components that are flying around. So they're used to a bill of materials for their cars. I think when it comes to software, they are now becoming so much more interconnected. There's so many places where, within the car, within the charging stations, within the customer platform, where I can, set things for my car. There's software used everywhere. I think we're seeing them start to think more about using a software bill of materials and having that be part of some of the, at least the recommendations in that industry. And then, Europe, again, I think is, they are talking about it. Again, the EU CRA does say that you can be asked for a software bill of materials. A lot of the other legislation and rules that we're seeing around how fast you have to report a vulnerability to a government. Now, that doesn't say you have to have an SBOM to do that, but, an SBOM is going to help you be able to quickly understand, where the vulnerability is, and be able to help you understand how do I respond to it, et cetera. So I think there's some underlying regulations that, having an SBOM is going to help you. And in other places, we're actually seeing governments say, we might come to you and we might ask you for that software bill of materials. You better be prepared to give it. I think definitely the U.S., the federal agencies have been really pushing the way on this. I think the DoD has information around this language in their in some of their contracts that they have to request it. And I think we'll probably see something like the Federal Acquisition Office. We will probably see them at some point update their contracts for the government to say, hey, you have to have an SBOM if you're going to sell to us. So I think we're slowly getting there. It's not happening overnight, but I do applaud the current, administration, especially CISA, has been really pushing SBOMs and the adoption of it. And I do think it's helped, at a minimum, if producers weren't doing it before, now they know they have to. At least they're creating it, even if they're not giving it to anybody. At least they're trying to create them and look at what vulnerabilities they have, what end-of-life libraries are they using. How risky is their own software?
Yeah, great point. All right, well, listen, Janet, this sounds like a fantastic conversation, and it's certainly it's a topic that's not going away anytime fast. Any final thoughts for the people before I let you go?
I would just say, please come and watch us. It's Wednesday, December 11th at 9:40 a.m. in Baltimore, Maryland. It's the Forrester Security and Risk Summit. And I have some really great panelists, so I really hope that everybody can join.